Good evening, everyone. May I now request Professor Chakraborty, Chairperson, Institute of Chinese Studies, to felicitate Professor Moon.
You can keep me, you can take that.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, we welcome you all to the third Gargi and V.P. Dutt Memorial Lecture. We are delighted to see such a distinguished gathering of scholars, colleagues, students, members of the diplomatic and policy community, and friends of the ICS. Before we begin, I would request everyone to kindly put their mobile phones on silent mode. The Gargi and V.P. Dutt Memorial Lecture is an annual event organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies as a tribute to the enduring scholarly legacy of two pioneering figures in Chinese studies in India, Gargi Dutt and Vidya Prakash Dutt. Their scholarship, role in institution building, and intellectual generosity continue to inspire generations of researchers and students. This series of lectures brings together eminent scholars to engage with some of the most pressing questions in East Asian politics, diplomacy, and society. This lecture series is supported by Ms. Anuradha Dutt, Managing Trustee of the Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Foundation. We also remain profoundly indebted to her for her generous support of the Institute of Chinese Studies and Harvard Institute Fellows through the multi-year doctoral fellowship in China Studies. The ICS would like to place on record its deep appreciation to the India International Center for collaborating with the ICS in this landmark lecture series. We also acknowledge the contribution of our media partner, ThePrint, who have steadfastly helped us in amplifying the visibility of this event and helping us connect with a wider audience. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Professor Moon, who is the James Laney Distinguished Professor at Yonsei University and Vice Chairman of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. He is also the Krauss Distinguished Fellow at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, University of California, and Editor-in-Chief of Global Asia. Professor Moon has served at the highest levels of South Korean government, including as Special Advisor to the President of Foreign Affairs and National Security, Chairman of the Sejong Institute, and Ambassador for International Security Affairs. He has been a special delegate to the Korean summits in 2000, 2007, and 2018 in Pyongyang, and has advised numerous government agencies on diplomacy, defense, and intelligence. Professor Moon is a prolific scholar who has authored over 60 books and 300 articles on international relations, Korean politics, and security issues. I do not wish to take up the limited time we have this evening to read out the titles of all that he has written. I will, however, mention some of the influential publications. They include Why American Foreign Policy is Failing, Moon Chung-in's Future Scenario, COVID-19, US-China New Cold War, and South Korea's Choice. What does Japan think now? And Exploring the Future of China. He has also edited books like Rethinking World and the US, Contending Perspectives, the United States and Northeast Asia with G. John Ikenberry, Understanding Kim Jong-un, North Korea with Robert Carlin, Weapons of Mass Destruction in Asia-Pacific with Peter Hayes and others, Bridging the Divide with John Talluri, The Routledge Handbook of Korean Politics and Public Administration with In Jae-moon, and The Future of East Asia. We are privileged to have with us a scholar and practitioner of such exceptional distinction, whose work has shaped important conversation on Korean Peninsula affairs, regional security, diplomacy, and peace building in East Asia. Today, he will speak on the theme of Sandwiched Between China and the US, South Korea's Quest of Transcending Diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Moon.
Where do I speak? Here or here?
I now will hand over to the... Okay. It is also my privilege to welcome Professor 𝐂𝐴𝐻, Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and a leading scholar of India-China relations, Chinese foreign policy, and regional strategic affairs. Professor 𝐂𝐴𝐻 has previously served as a professor and chairperson at the Center for East Asian Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has been widely recognized for her contributions to understanding the complexities of China and its engagement with the world. Without further ado, I now request Professor 𝐂𝐴𝐻 to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, Professor 𝐂𝐴𝐻.
Very good evening to you all. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to be chairing this session by a lecture by one of the most distinguished scholars from South Korea, and certainly a delight to welcome you all for this third Gargi and V.P. Dutt Memorial Lecture. This lecture series has been supported by Ms. Anuradha Dutt in the memory of her parents, who, as was pointed out earlier, were leading scholars and institution builders, and who have shaped the thinking, ideas, works of generations of China studies scholars and researchers in Delhi, and indeed throughout the country. The grant that has been given to us to host these series has enabled the Institute of Chinese Studies to bring to this platform some of the finest minds on China and East Asia over a period of time. And therefore, I will also take this opportunity to thank Ms. Dutt and the Gargi and V.P. Dutt Foundation to help us to host this lecture. And the IIC as well, which has emerged as one of the strongest collaborators of the Institute. I think the convergences in the kind of issues that we would like to bring to the public domain, and the kind of objectives that the IIC has in terms of taking these ideas also further, has brought us together in many a collaborative partnership. And therefore, I would like to thank the IIC as well for collaborating on this event. Now, I don't want to take too much time. I would rather let you hear our distinguished lecture for today. But frankly, I must admit that before his name was suggested to us for this lecture by Professor Sandeep Mishra, who is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, I had just heard the name, but after we decided to invite him, I started to read. For the last 2 months, I've been reading his writings, and I must tell you, it has been a fascinating journey. By turns, philosopher, strategic thinker, very, very profound understanding of international relations, very strong sense of history, and above all, one who does not hesitate to make his point clearly. And when we were in the run-up to the topic, we changed it once or twice, and finally we settled on this sandwiched between two. And we, of course, immediately said, yes, that's brilliant. And as I was reading what he was writing, it occurred to me that over the last few months, and particularly over the last 1 year, this phrase very adequately sums up not just South Korea, But I think at this juncture, it sums up just about everybody in the world today. It's a tough spot to be in when you are sandwiched. And I think today, all of us, to varying degrees, are sandwiched in different ways. What makes the parallel here interesting is that Professor Moon is looking at a middle power sandwiched between two great powers. And I think that's where the convergences become interesting, because what he's saying is that we need to now, as middle powers, understand our agency in dealing with a very, very complex scenario. Because, as he put it, we are running out of time, and inaction is only going to create more problems for us. So the cooperation of middle powers, what is the route that it should take? And I wonder whether he will bring in this theme of thinking the unthinkable, which is East Asia without the US. So these are some of the themes that I came across. Of course, he would take us on his on another journey, but I would like to therefore put before you the wonderful mosaic of ideas that have gone into the kind of writing and analysis that he's doing. So once again, thank you all very much. Thanks to Professor Moon for accepting our lecture, and we look forward to a really fascinating foray into the world of ideas.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it is great honor and pleasure for me to give a talk today. And I would like to thank Professor Chakrabarti for introducing me to your board as a speaker, and also Professor Acharya, thank you very much for moderating session. And Sandeep Mishra played a very important role in persuading me to work. In fact, I was S.T. Lee distinguished lecturer at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore for the past 2 weeks, and then Professor Mishra persuaded me to come over here by making the tour to South Korea, and I willingly decided to come over here. And also, before I get into my talk, as introduced as a founding editor-in-chief of Global Asia, I would like to introduce Global Asia. I really want more Indian participation in this quarterly journal. And I will circulate this journal around you. You can write down your name and email address, and you'll be under free subscription at least 2 years. Okay. Okay. I'm becoming very entrepreneurial, and after 2 years, you might have to subscribe. And from Indian side, you may know Nayan Chanda. Nayan Chanda is our book review editor, and he's really initiating member of Global Asia. And okay, with this brief introduction, I haven't heard about the Gargi and Dutt Memorial Lecture, and it was the first time for me to know about this wonderful lecture series. And I hope I can meet your expectation when I give a presentation. And Professor Mishra and I talked about the topic of this lecture, and I give several topics. And apparently he chose something about hegemonic rivalry between China and the United States, and what should be South Korean position. And in fact, he came up with the title of Sandwiched Between China and the United States. And I gave a more mundane title, but he gave much more sensible title, Sandwiched Between China and the United States. I was really fascinated with this topic because of my experience in Europe. I spent 2 months in Vienna from September to November last year. And I was asked to give talks on 8 different Schengen Treaty countries. And I asked them which topic they want me to give a talk. They all come up with Asia, East Asia without the US, East Asia minus US. Okay, what can we do? What should be the pattern of cooperation between Europe and South Korea to deal with unpredictable Trump 2.0? Okay, and I think, given that experience, I think that talking about sandwich syndrome between China and the United States would be the most ideal topic. When I was in Europe, one of the most popular quotation was from the Antonio Gramsci. You all know Antonio Gramsci's cultural hegemony and etc. If you read Antonio Gramsci's prison note, and there is a very interesting quote from him. That quote is, "Old order is dying, new order is struggling to be born. In this pregnum, morbid symptoms appear, monsters rise." And also he got out of prison in February 1936. There was a time of change in Europe. Okay, and starting with the 1929 Great Depression, economic hardship in Europe, inflation, unemployment, rise of Nazism, fascism, and also aggressive expansionist policies by Hitler, getting into Poland, Czechoslovakia, and etc. Therefore, what had happened in 1936 to 1939 is a kind of the phenomenon which is taking place right now. Okay, China is rising, America is declining. America is just giving up its old benign hegemonic role. In this interregnum, we see all the abnormal phenomena: Russian invasion of Ukraine, tragedy in Gaza, and also American-Israeli attack on Iran, and several other syndromes. But those are the symptoms, but the underlying cause can be seen in the structural changes in international politics, particularly American behavior. And American behavior has something to do with the Chinese rise. Okay? Therefore, we see growing strategic rivalry between China and the United States are changing the entire world. Look at Trump's behavior. Talk about Venezuela. Initially, Trump talked about the drug, Venezuelan drug coming into the United States. Then Miss Media come up with saying that Venezuelan drug account for the less than 0.5% of total drug inflow in the United States. And he changed his mind. All this Maduro regime was the sponsor behind the terrorist cartel. Okay? Again, that was proven not true. Then he get into the issue of oil. Then American oil companies say that we are not interested in going back to Venezuela. Okay? And then come with China. Okay? China has been using Venezuela as a platform to get into Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. Even Iran, now recent argument is what? Oh, I invaded Iran because of fear of Chinese rise and Chinese close connection with Iran for the securing of oil. But likewise, American behavior, particularly President Trump's behavior, eventually ended up with China. That means what? President Trump, even though if you read National Security Strategy Report and National Defense Strategy Report, China has been somewhat downplayed. However, you can clearly see importance of China in rhetorics and thinking of President Trump. Therefore, this strategic rivalry between China and the United States has become real and important. But you go back, 2010. 2010 was a very important year. 2010, China became #2 economy in the world. China became #1 trading country in the world, exceeding the United States. China became the largest foreign reserve holders. And China was giving more ODA to developing countries than the United States. And starting from 2010, China began to change its behavior. Okay. And you may look at what happened in the United States. And of course, early 1990s, okay, when after Tiananmen Square incident, etc., there was a debate on China threat. Okay, John Mearsheimer, Aaron, Friedberg, and they were talking about Chinese rising, Chinese fear, etc. That went down. But 2010, it came out. But again, there was a very interesting article by Andrew Nathan in Foreign Affairs, okay, around 2009, and it was a review article. And in that review article, Andrew Nathan argued that there are two schools in the United States. One is a Shanghai school led by Henry Kissinger. Another school is Air Crow School led by majority of Washington pundits. And I think his observation is extremely accurate. And Shanghai school simply argues that, look, Chinese rise is inevitable from historical trajectory. We got to accept it. We should seek co-evolution with China. That is beneficial to the United States. They have been arguing so-called G2, formula, okay? And Henry Kissinger and a bunch of American business leaders who are doing business in China, they all supported that argument. But up until that time, this Shanghai school was still influential in Washington. But the challenges coming from the Crow School was much stronger. Okay? Crow School simply argues that the current pattern of strategic rivalry between China and the United States is reminiscent of 1914, just before the First World War. Okay? And Graham Ellis argues that the tragedy of a Thucydides trap is becoming real. Okay, and therefore Chinese rise is real, and unless Chinese rise is curtailed, then it is inevitable to have a collision with China. Therefore, the United States should come up with all kinds of measures to slow down Chinese growth and suffocate China. Okay. But Kissinger, if you read his Un-China book, he clearly argues. Okay, he even mentioned this Crow School too. And that will be the surest way to military conflict between China and the United States, leading to World War III. Okay. But now, when I reflect back, Crow School has become much more powerful, and Shanghai School has become very much marginalized. Then, just before the advent of the Biden administration, Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan wrote a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs saying that neither Shanghai School nor Crow School, we need a new thinking. New thinking is China-US relations should be defined by strategic competition. And then when Biden became president, they adopted so-called 3 Cs, cooperation in critical areas, climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, pandemics. However, competition in trade and technology, and confrontation with issue of democracy, human rights, and Taiwan, and etc. This cooperation, confrontation, competition, confrontation. And apparently, Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan thought that that kind of triple approach would work, but that didn't working out. As long as the United States touches the issue of Taiwan, South China Sea, some other core interest of China, China was not cooperating. China was confronting with the United States. Therefore, confrontational dimension was undercutting arena for competition and cooperation. Okay. Then, now Trump 2.0 came, the things get much more confused. We do not know what is the Trump policy in China. Trump's transactional approach, it doesn't give a lot of attention to value issues and other issues. As long as China make economic concession to the United States, Trump is willing to engage with China, cooperate with China. Okay. MAGA is interested in homeland security and American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Only prioritizes what China hawks, such as 𝐂𝐴𝐴 and others. They have been arguing that China is still very important. American attention should be given to containment of China through the so-called strategy of denial. Okay, but in accordance with that approach, okay, Russia, China is no longer number one in the priority. Homeland security, the American hegemony in Western Hemisphere become the top priority. But of course, China was a number two, surpassing Europe in terms of priority ordering of American foreign policy. But all this China hoax by the Trump 2.0 has a very, very precarious position. Okay? They have been very much cornered by the MAGA folks. They couldn't speak out. That was reflected in National Security Strategy Report and National Defense Strategy Report. Then we have still primacist in the Trump administration, mostly from the mainstream Republicans. Marco Rubio, he used to be primacist, okay? And therefore, we have this primacist, and we still have some elements of neocons in the Republican Party. They would regard China, both the primacist and neocons would regard China as a number one enemy of the United States, okay? And still we have, liberal internationalists, which have become very much marginalized under Trump 2.0. But likewise, we do not see any coherent China policy under Trump 2, okay? But one thing is very clear. Historical inertia matters. Once China's threat was institutionalized in American policy making, that has become reality. Now I see four major battlegrounds between China and the United States. First, geopolitical battleground. The most important site with China Sea and Taiwan Strait. To some extent, Korean Peninsula. And all of a sudden, first island chain and second island chain have become one of the top concerns for the United States. Okay, and the American position is very clear, as evidenced by the Indo-Pacific strategy. Okay, United States should, form, intensified Quad cooperation, U.S., Japan, South Korea, and trilateral cooperation, U.S., Japan, the Philippines, Australian cooperation, and in whatever way to contain, encircle, and isolate China has become one of the important goals. And obviously, China will be very revolting against the kinds of strategic moves by the United States. Another battleground has been taking place in geo-economic domain. Okay? United States has been arguing that China ripped off the United States, and particularly the Trump administration argued that we should get all the economic opportunities given to China back to the United States. Through decoupling, de-risking, reshoring, friend-shoring, near-shoring, whatever means, okay? And therefore, U.S. wanted to slow down Chinese economic growth by diverting away its partners' trade and investment in China. That has been taking place, and America has been putting a lot of pressure on South Korea, Japan, European countries to slow down their investment in China and divert those investments in the United States. The other areas is, technology area. Okay, but as you all know, that China has become more competitive than the United States in technology. But in the past, the United States was too arrogant. They thought that all the technology comes from the United States. proprietary technologies all come from the United States and etc. But if you look at the so-called Nikkei has been coming up with a rank ordering of technology competition. Starting from 2018, China was beating the United States in 9 categories, 10 in items. The semiconductor chips, the drones, okay, biomedical, and etc. All in quantum computing, US was ahead of China. In all 9 areas, China was beating the US in terms of number of patents. Okay? That trend continues. Okay? Therefore, United States really wanted to slow it down because technology is so important. It is important for competition. It is important for weapons development and national security. It is important for international technology standard. Okay? Therefore, United States realized it. Therefore, United States has been putting very hard pressure on its allies and partners, okay, to get away from any kinds of technological cooperation with China. Therefore, technology has become the new front line of competition between China and the United States. Finally, value and international governance. Okay. Under Trump, value has become less important, but during the Biden administration, value was very, very important. The United States was forming coalition of democracy, and South Korea was a member of the coalition of democracy to counter China and Russia and North Korea. Okay? But that inertia still continues, okay? Coalition of democracy, and also international global governance. The United States has been defining China as a country that does not respect rule of law. Okay? But in reality, that is not. The US has been violating rule of law more than China. Okay? But anyhow, that is Chinese argument. They're focusing on Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. China does not respect international law, rule of law, and etc. All other countries gang up together and criticize China, try to correct the Chinese behavior. Okay? But again, China has been more proactive than the United States. Xi Jinping proposed global development initiative, global security initiative, global civilizational initiative, and global governance initiative. Particularly in global governance initiative, obviously, China is trying to protect liberal international order which was created by the United States. Meanwhile, the United States has been trying to destroy it. Okay? Therefore, we see a very interesting pattern of Trump. Initially, I thought that the Trump is a disruptive leader. Okay? Therefore, American experts have been defining Trump as the leadership of disruption. But that means what? Breaking up all the traditional inertia deeply embedded in American society. But now we see Trump transformed from disruptive leader into destructive leader. Okay, therefore, in other international governance, United States has very little thing to say, and particularly in the light of American-Israeli military attack on Iran, and I think that it will have a less, legitimacy. Okay. Then how South Korea has been sandwiched in 4 battleground? Very straightforward. United States, the most telling example can be found in the case of THAAD, the terminal high altitude a missile defense system. Okay, U.S. wanted to deploy THAAD in 2016, but there was a debate in South Korea because a lot of experts argue that THAAD is not fit for South Korea. THAAD is mainly for the interception of ICBM. Okay, if United States failed to intercept in East Sea, Sea of Japan, or Alaska, then in final terminal staging, okay, U.S. interception missiles would shoot down at the altitude of 150 kilometers. Okay, therefore, THAAD is for ICBM, not the short-range missile come from North Korea. But a lot of experts thought that X-band radar, which comes up with THAAD, has a very long-range detection function. Therefore, a lot of experts argue that the American demand of setting up the THAAD base in South Korea is to utilize X-band radar to detect and make a surveillance of Chinese military missile activities, and etc. That is why China strongly opposed that idea. China came up with economic sanctions, cultural sanctions against South Korea. Therefore, we were really sandwiched. Finally, we resolved the problem. The Moon Jae-in government resolved the problem. At the time, Chinese consensus three things. First, is South Korea going to allow additional deployment of THAAD? Moon Jae-in government position is no, we are not going to allow. Second question was, is South Korea going to join America-led theater missile defense system? And our government position is no. Regardless of conservative or progressive government, South Korean government didn't want to join theater missile defense system because South Korea is the most front line. Okay? We detect the information first and we share with Japan and the United States. Yet, we pay almost $4 billion to join the theater missile defense system. That is why South Korea, even Kim Dae-jung, even Lee Myung-bak, conservative government said that we are not interested in joining theater missile defense. Third, Chinese raised the issue of whether South Korea is going to join the US, Japan, South Korean trilateral alliance. Of course, South Korean government said no, because we are alliance with the US, not with Japan. If we recognize Japan as an ally, then we'll be allowing Japan to go for constitutional amendment with peace constitution. Okay? Japan does not have a regular army. Okay? If Japan becomes our ally, then it will give a good rationale for Japan, particularly conservative in Japan, to push for a constitutional amendment of peace constitution. Therefore, we are not going to have the kind of trilateral alliance or bilateral alliance with Japan. And Chinese government was finally, persuaded, and they lifted, economic sanctions and etc. But since then on, Chinese people began to have a very negative perception of South Korea. Therefore, Chinese people's perception of South Korea has been negative since then on, and we are trying to change it. Anyhow, likewise, and also, United States wanted us to join, for example, whenever American government hold the Quad summit, they want South Korea to be observer to the Quad. And also, during the Yonsei government period, we activated the US, Japan, South Korea trilateral military cooperation. We are still conducting US, Japan, South Korea trilateral military exercise. And also, the United States wants us to be part of so-called NATO plus IP4, NATO plus Indo-Pacific 4. 4 means what? Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And previous government, Yonsei government, used to attend the NATO summit meeting and send the defense ministers to the meeting. But under 𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚 government, he hasn't attended that NATO summit. He has been somewhat cautious about joining a IP4, okay, NATO plus IP4. Therefore, likewise, on the one hand, American pressure on South Korea to activate and intensify, cooperation with American alliance system, and on the other hand, China has been putting pressure on South Korea to watch out. In fact, when I was a special advisor to President Moon Jae-in, then Foreign Minister 𝐁𝐸 visited Seoul, and I had a breakfast with him together. And I asked him, what do you want from South Korea? Okay, we cannot give up our alliance with the United States. What do you want? And his answer was very intriguing. He was simply saying that we know it, and your alliance with the United States is your sovereign right. Therefore, we cannot ask you to terminate in whatever. But what we want is you take a neutral position, okay? And therefore, if you take while maintaining alliance with the United States, if you take a rather neutral position, we'll welcome the posture. Then I would tell him, how can we have alliance with the United States, we take a neutral position? It's contradictory. But whole point that he was saying that non-deployment of 𝐶AD, okay? No additional deployment of 𝐶AD. And particularly Chinese are extremely sensitive to the potential American deployment of a medium-range ballistic missile in South Korea aiming Chinese mainland, okay? And therefore we are somewhat sandwiched, okay? For example, when we do US, Japan, South Korea trilateral military exercises, sometimes we conduct joint air exercise and training in the Yellow Sea. Chinese are extremely sensitive to that movement, okay? And also we conducted that kind of exercise in East Sea. Russians are very, very sensitive to our move. Therefore, we are in a sense sandwiched between China and the United States. In the economic area, it's very clear, because we have been diverting our direct investment in China into the United States, because the U.S. has been twisting our arms to make more investment in the U.S. It's both Biden administration and Trump administration. Up to now, we have made almost $180 billion investment in the United States. Samsung Electronics alone is making investment. If their investment is completed, they will be investing about $200 billion in one city, Taylor City, Texas. Okay. Therefore, but meanwhile, our investment in China has been shrinking rapidly. Okay. And up to 2 years ago, China was the #1 trading partner with us. Okay. Now, last year, China became #1 trading partner. The US became #1 trading partner. But I think that was a result of American pressure. Okay. But there is another reason too. Chinese firms have become extremely competitive. Korean firms which made investment in China were not making profit. Therefore, they decide to leave China market and get into Vietnam, Cambodia, and other Southeast Asian countries. Therefore, one thing is American decoupling, de-risking factor played some role, but more importantly, changing competitive climate in China has changed South Korean firms to move away from China. But anyhow, this decoupling, if not decoupling, de-risking has been taking place. There has been quite large number of reshoring and the nearshoring, and not friendshoring, but I would say the reshoring and nearshoring has been taken place. And third, technology. Again, American concern is South Korea should not transfer cutting-edge technology to China, particularly in chips, okay, semiconductor chips. Now, Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix had a huge plant in China. Okay. And in order to be competitive in China, they should upgrade their equipment. But those equipment is based on American technology. The US does not allow Samsung and SK Hynix to improve its equipment in China. More than that, it's not only just from the US. For example, Dutch, the Netherlands, is a source of a very important technology. Okay? And then Samsung and SK Hynix were trying to get the Dutch technology to improve its production facilities in China. Again, US put the pressure on Dutch government not to allow the transfer of that advanced technology. Therefore, and also another thing is China has been very aggressive in digital platform, okay, TikTok and whatever. And China has been putting a lot of, the U.S. has been putting a lot of pressure on South Korea to be very cautious in the sense that South Korea joined Chinese digital platform. And also operating system too. U.S. has been putting a lot of pressures on us not to adopt, Chinese operating system. Another good example, Huawei has been trying to get into Korean market. And Huawei imports more than $2 billion worth of parts and components from South Korea every year. And therefore, Huawei wanted to increase its market share in South Korea too. But American pressure is so heavy. Therefore, likewise, the United States has been preventing South Korea from getting into the closer technological cooperation with China. China, I think, gave up working with South Korea. And because China is getting ahead. For example, in electric vehicle battery, China is ahead of us. And all this alternative technology development, China is ahead of us. It's a displayer. LG Display used to have its plant in Shanghai. Even President Xi Jinping visited there 2024. 2025, they decide to live in China because LG Display has been losing competitiveness in China. Hyundai Motors is a different case. Hyundai Motors used to have about 9% market share in Chinese automobile market, but it went down 1%, partly because of SARS in the issue. But the Chairman Chung Il-sung of Hyundai Motors argued that if we lose in Chinese market, we will lose in world market. They decided to reinvest in China. Okay, but again, the U.S. has been putting heavy pressure on Hyundai Motors to make more investment in the United States. To what extent, even though they are making a lot of profit, to what extent they can invest in China is very unclear. Therefore, Korean firms are sandwiched. Korean government is less, but Korean companies are sandwiched between China and the United States in the context of China-U.S. strategic rivalry. Okay, and the issue of value and global governance, Lee government, current government, is pursuing very pragmatic foreign policy. Therefore, Lee government has not, declared its intention whether it will continue to join coalition of democracy or not. Okay, and on issue of global governance, okay, I think South Korean government is more likely, prone toward China rather than the United States, because the United States has been destroying liberal international order. China has been trying to preserve it. Therefore, it seems quite natural that the South Korea to be more sympathetic with the Chinese position. Okay, what should be South Korean strategic responses? But before we get into that one, President Lee Jae-myung met President Trump August last year, and again in late October last year, twice. The U.S. has been pushing for modernization of ROK-US alliance. As part of a modernization of ROK-US alliance, President Trump has been demanding two things. Okay? In fact, three things. One is South Korea's increase of defense spending to 5% of GDP, and also greater share of defense cost related to the maintaining American forces in South Korea. Second demand was that, we have 28,000 American forces in South Korea. Okay, the Korean government should allow South Korean government should allow the U.S. government to move in and move out its forces in South Korea without due consultation with the South Korean government. In fact, they did. They took out the THAAD unit and the Patriot unit just a week ago from South Korea to Gulf area. Therefore, but our government position is not good idea, because if there is a arbitrary in and out of American forces in South Korea, that can create a power vacuum on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea can take advantage of that kind of power vacuum. Therefore, it will increase strategic instability on the Korean Peninsula. Our government position is no. Another third demand was what? The Trump administration wants the South Korean government to come up with a formal and official support of a commitment of military support in the case of contingencies in Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Our government said no. Okay, and therefore, in a sense, our government is trying to get away from entanglement of U.S.-China conflict in Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. I don't know to what extent our government can maintain that position, but President Trump is pushing very hard that the South Korean government to take very clear position with the United States as opposed to China. Okay. There is a kind of a sandwich situation in South Korea. Then what are the countervailing strategies? There is no formal consensual strategy, but I can tell you about 70% of South Korean citizens support the idea of maintaining status quo through muddling through. That means what? Maintain alliance with the United States, at the same time, maintain strategic cooperative partnership with China. It's kind of double hedging strategy. But when China-US relations are good, that strategy works. But when the China-US relation get bad, that strategy does not work. That is what is happening right now. But ordinary citizens in South Korea want both. And also, current leadership in South Korea also want both. Alliance with the US, strategic cooperative partnership with China. But conservative forces, both pundit as well as conservative citizens in South Korea, want pro-American balancing strategy. Their view is very simple and straightforward. Okay? America is still hegemon. China is a challenger. It is always safe to bet on hegemon, not with the challenger. Okay? And therefore, it is better for us to take side with the United States to suppress rise of challenger China. That is good for the national interest of South Korea. Therefore, they argue that South Korea should be a very active member of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And we should work with the United States in whatever way. For example, now, Strait of Hormuz, those conservative, and we have a so-called opposition party, People's Power Party, okay, they strongly argue that we should send our naval ships to Strait of Hormuz instantly. Okay. But on the other, we have a very small segment of particular historians who want that taking side with the United States can be very dangerous. If we look back to Korean history, bandwagoning China would be much more proper strategy for South Korea. In the 17th century, 𝐏𝐿, the Qing dynasty, was about on the rise. Ming dynasty was declining. But at the time, King In-jo took side with declining Ming dynasty. Hong Tai-ji, the son of the founder of Qing dynasty, invaded Korean peninsula. And our king had to make a 9 kowtow to Hong Tai-ji. That was the most humiliating moment in Korean diplomatic history. The historians always want to South Korean people. You remember the humiliation of King In-jo. He made the wrong choice of taking side with the declining hegemon Ming and ignoring rising hegemon. Okay? But the king just before In-jo, the Hwang-hae-gun, he was arguing that we should have a friendship relationship with the Qing dynasty, but he was ignored. Even he was replaced by the King In-jo. pro-Ming forces. Therefore, historians still argue that by using that historical example, you got to watch out. The putting everything into the U.S. can be self-defeating. Then there's another school, third school. They are nationalists in both conservative and progressive. Conservative nationalists argue that we cannot trust the big powers. We have been victim of big power politics. We should have nuclear weapons. And then nuclear armed middle power is the answer to our problem. Then US, China, Japan, Russia, they cannot treat us easily. Therefore, we should acquire nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, progressive argue that nuclear is not the solution. We should follow the example of Switzerland, permanent neutrality. And particularly unified Korea with a permanent neutral status would be our solution. But again, very few people would support that idea. There are two, particularly permanent neutrality is a good idea, but in terms of implementability, the feasibility is totally not feasible. And those are the current debates going on. Therefore, public sentiment support the continuation of status quo through muddling through or double hatching. But conservative still arguing that we should go along with the United States. Very small segments say that we may better than China, but the majority, we go together. And the leadership should come up with a diplomatic wisdom to pursue both alliance and strategic cooperative partnership with China. But I personally argue that I have been arguing that we need to have so-called the transcending diplomacy. The term transcending diplomacy came from the Paul Schrader. He was a U.S. diplomatic historian, European diplomatic historian who used to teach at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He passed away 5 years ago. He came up with a very interesting argument saying that look at the 100 years of European peace. That was a result of Vienna Congress, 1815 Paris Peace, Convention, and then creation of a Council of Power. But who played an important role in creating European Council of Power? It's not big powers, not UK or Russia or France. It was so-called middle powers, Austria, Preußen. Therefore, middle powers can cooperate together and they can create new norms, principles, rules, and procedures. And I personally think it's time for these middle powers or middle positioned powers to work together to create that kind of transcending diplomacy so that we can restore multilateral order, we can foster open regionalism, and we can also facilitate cultural pluralism, and also we can push for the idea of a collective security system as opposed to collective defense system, as the United Nations Charter dictate. And also in the case of South Korea, to get away from this kind of sandwich dilemma, we need, on the one hand, this more active participation in this transcending diplomacy. On the other hand, we need the diversification. Therefore, in South Korea, India is the #1 partner for our diversification, particularly when President Moon Jae-in was running the Republic of Korea. He maintained very good ties with Prime Minister Modi. They were very close. And also at the time, President Moon Jae-in pursued the new Southern politics. The new Southern policy excluded Australia and New Zealand, but included India, and gave more weight to India as opposed to ASEAN. Therefore, even ASEANs were not happy about that one. But I think that Lee Jae-myung government is likely to revive this new southern politics and intensify cooperation with India as part of this diversification strategy. And I think, therefore, for us, how to overcome sandwich dilemma? On the one hand, pursue and have a so-called overall national consensus for the continuation of status quo through muddling through / double hatching. At the same time, try to lead transcending diplomacy through the coalition of middle power or middle positioned countries, and at the same diversify its diplomatic lines, and particularly with India, Brazil, those BRICS members, okay, and also try to come up with a domestic national consensus. Korea is very divided, okay, particularly in foreign policy, and how to deal with North Korea, whether we should have nuclear weapons or not, and how to deal with the United States. Therefore, we are extremely divided. And I think the Lee government should pursue policy which is based on national consensus. That is, I think, the reasonable way for us to overcome current sandwich situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moon. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody that this was truly a fascinating insight into not just the dynamics within South Korea, but also in terms of offering a blueprint, giving us possibilities and some opportunities for creatively thinking about how to deal with the current crisis. I was absolutely fascinated by the range of debates that are taking place in Korea. I mean, just that there are so many groups, the conservatives, the traditionalists, and the newer ones, and so on. I think there's a very fascinating debate about where Korea is headed. Of course, one got a sense of the elite politics and the kind of differences among different groups. But I wonder what would be the position of the Korean people here, because I was reading at some point, some time back, that among the people there is still a very strong pro-US sentiment, and that they would rather go along with the US because they say this is the known devil. So is there any way in which the current choices are reflecting, or at least the way in which the current choices will go, reflecting some mood of the people out here? But the position of the middle powers that you are putting out, and the kind of things that are in the realm of the possible, as you have argued, I wonder, I mean, the best thing would be, yes, muddling through and at the same time transcending. That's a very interesting kind of bookends that you put. But I wonder whether we will be given the luxury of taking the time and the space to make these choices. Is the situation, which is developing very rapidly, actually thrust upon us a situation where we will have no option but to make, take stands or make choices? And in that case, really, it may not always work out in our national interests, as we have seen so far. So these are just some of the thoughts that come. I mean, this is not intended as a kind of a question, but just that while we look at how we would like to shape our foreign policy choices based on our national interests, I wonder whether we will be given the opportunity and the space to, given the fast pace of changes that are taking place. And actually, people are talking about how we are not saying it, but we are actually in a third world war. And just as we came to non-traditional threats to security, we are now in a situation where we have non-traditional ways of waging war. So, so it is a pretty grim situation. But let me just, normally after our memorial lectures, we don't really take questions, but I think what you raised would generate some questions. Would you like to take some questions on
Please.
So, okay, oh, wow, wow. Okay, so I see 1 and 2 and 3, 4. Oh. Now, I will make 2 requests only. Number 1, please keep your questions focused and short, and try and not sort of take too much time in terms of putting forward an argument. We want to hear Professor Moon clarify if there are any certain questions. So, Ambassador Suri, you were the first to raise your hand.
Thank you for a brilliant lecture. I have 2 questions and 1 issue, if you could shed some more light on it. In this sandwich, you didn't speak about North Korea, how the North Korean problem can be handled. If you could just say some few words about that. But my 2 questions are about your double hedging strategy. You talked about a strategic cooperative partnership with China. In your view, what should this contain? What are the elements of this strategic cooperative partnership? And you talked about the middle powers and BRICS. So does South Korea have any intentions of wanting to join BRICS?
So, Ambassador Suri has been very distinguished diplomat. He has been our ambassador in China. So maybe those who are asking questions can identify themselves. So yeah, first you, then you, and then we come. Yes, Vajra.
Thank you, Excellency. It was a very revealing.
No, I'm sorry. We had you will come in after the others have had. Yes, please.
My name is Prakash. We're talking about sandwiching between the US and China. For South Korea, my point is that it was said that people of South Korea prefer the US. The point is the amount of trade that South Korea is doing with China and with the US, and the interaction and exchange of students and tourists. Is this increasing with China, or is it still more with the US? Is there a change coming in this respect? Thank you.
So we'll take 1 more, then maybe you respond, and then we'll take the second round. Yes, that gentleman at the end.
My name is M.B. Chandar. I work for media. My question is regarding this trade and investment. The West Asia crisis is just now started. 2 weeks have gone. And other wars are also going on. Whether South Korea has any impact on the trade and investment, although it is a small country, or you are independent of those crises?
Very interesting questions. China used to be very, very important mediator between North and South Korea. Whenever there are breakdown in communication between Pyongyang and Seoul, we rely on China. But for some strange reasons, Zhongyanbu, Chinese External Relations Department, has not been very, very active. Therefore, we relied on the American New York channel in communicating with Pyongyang. Even that is shut down too. According to reliable source, DPRK mission at the United Nations is not getting any phone calls or emails coming from State Department. Therefore, there is no communication between the US and DPRK. Okay? And China, as you know, that the party has more close ties with the Department of International Relations of Korea Workers' Party. Since September 3rd, last year, the Victory Parade, there has been increasing interactions, but still, China is not in the position to facilitate inter-Korean, dialogue, because the North Korean leader declared that the North-South Korean relations are now hostile two-state relations, and he also declared that Pyongyang will not talk with Seoul unless Seoul, give up its ambition for unification. Okay, therefore, Chinese role hasn't been less visible with regard to the Korean Peninsula. China has been very, very cautious. In fact, when President Lee Jae-myung visited Beijing in January, he asked President Xi Jinping's role in helping improving inter-Korean relations and opening communication between Pyongyang and Seoul. President Xi Jinping told President 𝐂𝐥𝐤𝐚, please be patient. And that was his answer. And also, I personally support the South Korea joining BRICS. Okay? That is a real diversification strategy. But our foreign ministry and also Office of President, National Security Council, they tend to be more geared toward the United States. Okay? But depending on how the United States, Trump administration behaves, there might be growing voice for South Korea joining in the BRICS. I think problem is this. In Korea, the United States used to be our window to the world. We are too much geared toward the West. Even though we were developing countries, we always aspired to be developed country and Western tilted country. Therefore, now even current progressive government talking about joining G7. Okay. And they are not talking about BRICS because our foreign ministry tend to be very conservative. But 𝐂𝐥𝐻 is a very smart person, and he understands the meaning of diversification. Therefore, I think that there will be discussions on the possibility of diversifying by joining BRICS. Okay, and some progressive members of National Assembly have been talking about that one. And when I go back to Seoul, I raised this issue in the members of National Assembly so that we can talk about the possibility of joining BRICS. And also, the second question and comments, you're absolutely right. We Koreans prefer Americans, okay? Therefore, I would say that about 70% of South Koreans have very pro-American stance. About 70% of South Korea would say they are strongly opposed China. Therefore, about 25 to 30% show a very pro-China attitude. But when they are asked about which country to choose, okay, then they said, oh, we want both China and the United States. The 70% would say that we should maintain good relations with China and the United States. Okay. Therefore, it's very contradictory. But, and also, it has something to do with the degree of education and enlightenment. If we cut the ties with China, then our economy can be crippled. Then they tend to be much more cautious. Even though they do not like China, they realize the importance of maintaining strategic cooperative partner with China. Therefore, this opinion survey can be extremely misleading. Because you look at any opinion survey in South Korea, 70 to 80% South Koreans support the US, okay, and they oppose China, okay? But if you get into deeper with a different design of questionnaires, then you realize that most of South Koreans want the double hedging, when taking with one side. Okay. And student number has been increased. The Chinese government is still very, very conservative. Chinese government hasn't get away from the shock of COVID-19. But tourists are increasing both sides, because Chinese government allowed visa-free entrance by South Korean tourists. That facilitates large inflow of Korean tourists getting into China. And also South Korean, the 𝐂𝐥𝐻 government also began to allow the visa-free entrance if it is a group tour. And then Chinese tourists have been on the rise very recently. In the past, the Chinese used to go to Japan because of Prime Minister Takaichi's remark on Taiwan, and plus several, and also visa issues too. Chinese tourist visit to Japan rapidly declined, while their visit to South Korea rapidly increased. Therefore, I would say that tourist visit was a very important factor, and particularly, President Lee Jae-myung's visit to Beijing in January played a very important role. You may recall that, President Xi Jinping gave a Xiaomi mobile phone to President Lee Jae-myung as a gift in late October, and he brought that mobile phone to Beijing, and then proposed to President Xi Jinping, "Why don't we take a selfie?" And then both couples took the photo by the Xiaomi phone. And that was broadcast in the entire China. Therefore, Lee Jae-myung became very popular in China. That really changes Chinese people's behavior. And finally, Middle East, that has become big trouble for Lee Jae-myung government. And in fact, yesterday there was a hearing at the National Assembly. And members of National Assembly raised a question to Ambassador Cho Hyun, former Ambassador Cho Hyun, former Ambassador to India, Cho Hyun. Now he became foreign minister. And he neither confirmed nor denied that there was a request from the United States. Therefore, he said, "I cannot give you an answer," because there was neither request nor, the lack of request and whatever. Therefore, his position was that. And then in the afternoon, yesterday afternoon, our defense minister answered the question, "Did you get any formal request from the United States?" There was no formal request. Since there is no formal request, we are not deliberating on the possibility of sending our warship to Strait of Hormuz. And our government position is the same as the European countries, okay? Being opportunistic. Okay, let us wait and see what will happen to the current conflict in the Gulf. Okay, therefore, and also we have been very successful in cooperating with the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates recently decided to send 18 million barrels of oil to South Korea, and as a special measure. Therefore, we are trying to be as opportunistic as India and Europe. Okay, you have been very successful in securing LNG tanker. Okay, and we are learning from India. So that, and let us see what will happen today. 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐧 is visiting Washington, and President Trump is hosting a lunch and dinner. Let us see what Prime Minister 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐧 answers to, respond to Trump, and then our president will decide afterwards.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll have just one more round with 3 questions. Ambassador Tyal.
I am 𝐶𝐿 Tyal, former ambassador to your country. My question is about Russia. If Indo-Pacific is moving towards some kind of a G2, and other major powers like India, Korea, Japan are getting squeezed, how do you look at Russia? In India, we have placed a lot of faith in some kind of independent foreign policy of Russia, and we really don't see it is fully in the lap of China. What is your view about that? Thank you.
Good evening, sir. I'm Priyam. I'm a student at Delhi University. I wanted to ask, as it presently is, the picture that is portrayed about South Korea's demography, it's one of declining population and a collapsing total fertility rate. So I wanted to ask how in the future that can affect your leverage vis-a-vis, in negotiations vis-a-vis China and the United States.
Vaijayanti Raghavan from Korean Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. My question dovetails with Ambassador Suri's question on North Korea, but from the American point of view. Trump has expressed interest in wanting to meet Kim Jong-un during his visit to Beijing. I think President 𝐏𝐥𝐤𝐚 would also be keen that President Trump meets with Kim Jong-un. What kind of an outcome does Trump expect? And what is the kind of outcome that South Korea would be happy out of this visit? Thank you.
Ambassador Tyer's question, that's a very important question, because let me talk about the Russian perception of South Korea. 2 years ago, I was invited by the Russian Foreign Ministry, and they were sending me, he asked me to convey 3 messages to South Korean people and government. He was a very senior position, he held a very senior position at the Russian Foreign Ministry. First, he's saying, South Korea is an unfriendly nation. But among the unfriendly nations, South Korea is the most friendly nation. We want to maintain good relations. And then he was asking me, please tell Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motors to come back and reopen plant. War will be coming end very soon. Okay? And third, don't try to disturb our normalization effort with the DPRK. Okay? However, will not cooperate with the DPRK in such a way to undermine security of South Korea, because South Korea is so important to us. However, if South Korea provide Ukraine with lethal weapons, then South Korea will be our enemy, and also will expedite our military cooperation with North Korea. You can reverse that comment for South Korea. South Korea, same thing. Okay, particularly the previous Yonsei government, Russia, along with China and North Korea, they are axis of evil. Okay, and they are enemy of a coalition of democracy. But 𝐏𝐤𝐚 government will think in different way. Okay, we have plenty of room for cooperation with Russia. If we maintain very good cooperation with Russia, they can help reducing tension on the Korean Peninsula, and they still believe Russia will not play double game, because their economic gain from South Korea will be greater than their security gain from North Korea after war is over. Therefore, we buy that argument. Therefore, we do not want to break ties with Russia. We want to maintain good relations. I don't know, but we are really hoping that Russia would end the war with Ukraine as soon as possible. Because otherwise the Chinese will be taking over South Korean plant in Russia. Hyundai Motors plant in St. Petersburg, LG chemistry plant in Siberia, and Samsung plant in Moscow. Nowadays, Chinese firms are picking up all those foreign plant in China, in Russia. Therefore, we are trying to avoid the situation. Therefore, that will go well. And about the student from Delhi University, future of Korean democracy and whatever, I think the Korean democracy is better than American democracy. And, to be honest with you, we can impeach president, but U.S. cannot impeach the president. American president can instruct the Department of Justice to make a political interventions. In South Korea, you cannot do that. If you do that, you are subject to impeachment. Okay. Therefore, in the past, we have learned from American democracy, and now we are saying that there's a general feeling among Korean citizens that, we thought American democracy is number one, but now I think South Korean democracy seems to be better than American democracy. And also, if you look at American behavior, you cannot blame the Chinese Communist Party behavior. Okay, that is kind of sentiment. Therefore, I think that if a new government comes in the U.S. and talk about the democracy as a common weaving point, I think the U.S. will be losing appeal to other countries. And about the Kim Jong-un issues, yes, when President 𝐏𝐤𝐚 met President Trump in August last year, he came up with a wonderful proposal saying that you become peacemaker, I will be pacemaker. Okay? And so that you can win Nobel Peace Prize. And Trump was just so happy. Okay? And he set aside all other differences. You're right, I will play important role. I know Kim Jong-un very well, he respects me. But nothing happened afterwards. And when President Trump visited Gyeongju in late October and early December last year, we tried to persuade the Trump administration to have some kind of contact with North Korea and have a summit in Panmunjom, but that didn't work it out. Because the United States Trump administration has been trying to get a communication with Pyongyang, but that didn't happen. Even 2 days before Trump's visit to South Korea, he proposed to North Koreans, okay, I'm willing to lift your sanctions against North Korea. Come out, let us talk. North Korea didn't respond. Then now, and President Lee Jae-myung sent the Prime Minister Kim Min-seok to Washington just 3 days ago. And he met the Vice President J.D. Vance, and also he met President Trump. And he again raised that issue. Okay, why don't you meet Chairman Kim Jong-un on the way to Beijing on March 31st? And according to report, President Trump called his staff. Oh, please check. Okay, make sure that I met Kim Jong-un on the way back to Washington from Beijing. Okay, and then following day he decided to put off his visit to Beijing for 1 more month, and we do not know whether he will be able to visit Beijing in April. Okay, then there's another chance. There is in early December there will be APEC summit in Shenzhen, China. Okay, and I think that as a fallback strategy, our government is working on his visit to APEC summit in Shenzhen. But again, who knows? If China-U.S. relations get worsened, he may decide not to attend APEC because he didn't give a shit about APEC. You remember, he didn't attend the APEC summit, even though he came to South Korea. He just joined the dinner, and then without attending APEC summit, he just left Korea. Therefore, it's very unpredictable. Therefore, Kim Jong-un should learn. He should talk with Lee Jae-myung directly. He should not rely on Washington. Okay. No, the aspect is now big hurdle to U.S. DPRK dialogue has been American demand of denuclearization of North Korea. Particularly State Department and the Pentagon have been insisting on it. But North Korean position is this: if the United States come up with a denuclearization, not talk. But American position has been very, very unclear. Trump was once saying that, North Korea is a nuclear power nation and all these kinds of things. But State Department position is in line with Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Their common ground is denuclearization. But the Kim Jong-un position is that, look, North Korea is a nuclear weapon state which is recorded under North Korean Constitution. Therefore, if you come up with a denuclearization agenda, we won't talk. Then Lee Jae-myung proposed so-called incremental approach, a 3-step approach. Freezing of North Korean nuclear missile activities in short term, and then rolling back and reduction of North Korean nuclear and missile arsenal, and in the long term, denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. Then he has been arguing that we should focus on freezing and reduction. Okay? Then US and South Korea, Japan should come up with incentive to North Korea. But we haven't talked about, therefore 3 countries, Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, haven't talked about what kinds of incentives. Therefore, for example, our government is willing to accept the idea that if United States come up with a diplomatic normalization for just freezing, not even reduction. And lifting sanctions for reduction and rolling back. But it is my understanding that there is no fuller discussion between Seoul and Washington on these issues. But most importantly, there's nobody in White House who can handle North Korean issue, unlike Trump 1.0. The only person who can handle is Alison Hooker, but she's now Undersecretary of State for Global Security and Political Affairs. She has so many other agendas. But other than Alison Hooker, there's nobody who can handle it. Okay? Michael and Wong, okay, he used to be the Deputy National Security Advisor, but he was kicked out. Okay? And Kevin Kim, who was the acting ambassador in South Korea and was a special advisor to the Alison Hooker, now he's assigned to the ASEAN embassy, U.S. embassy, ASEAN embassy, ambassador in Jakarta. Therefore, I wonder, whether there are any person who can handle this in the nuclear issues. Therefore, I would say it is rather bleak.
Last question on demography.
Demography. I didn't misquote your question. Okay. What was it?
I wanted to know the effect of Korea's declining demography.
Like declining, not democracy.
Yeah.
I mistook it. That is a real big problem. Okay. But as a result of government support, our fertility rate increased from 0.78% to 0.81%. We are all impressed by the growth. But apparently now, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore, they are competing each other. They're all 0.8 and 0.9 rebel. But I think it's a big problem. First, the security impact is profound. We used to have 600,000 soldiers. Now we have 500,000 soldiers. Within 5 years, we'll be having about 300,000 soldiers. Therefore, our response is what? Automation, introducing more AI. Okay, and also Korea is extremely conservative on immigration. Okay, therefore there is a big problem. Therefore, most important visible impact is on security. Yeah. Shrinkage of armed forces. Second, impact on economy. Okay, and it's very profound. The economic size is a function of population size. If we have a diminishing population size, and it will have a negative impact on GDP growth and also market size. If market is shrinking, then if demand is shrinking, then the supply will be shrunken. Then entire so-called production system, investment system will be in trouble. Therefore, it's a very serious problem. Okay, and also if current trend continues, particularly South Korean race may be eliminated under growth. Yeah, if current trend continues by a year, within 90 years time period, there's virtually no Korean race under Korean problem. But problem is this young generation in South Korea, Z generation, are not paying attention to it. That is none of our business kind of things. Then they don't give great attention to the patriotism. Now, having more children is a sign of patriotism, but the young generation in South Korea rejected that idea. Therefore, it will take much more time. Therefore, changes in social system, welfare system, and also changing, mindset of the young people. They should all work together. But that will be the most challenging issue. Therefore, I would say the democratic challenge will be a more serious challenge than U.S.-China strategic rivalry.
Well, a rather grim note to end on, but now remains for me to express deep gratitude and thanks to our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Moon, It was really a very, very thought-provoking lecture. Many, many ideas, many interesting insights into what is happening in the South Korean political foreign policy discourse. And your immense experience of both policy making and teaching and research has blended beautifully into giving us a very comprehensive picture about the kind of challenges that face South Korea today. So for that we are deeply grateful, and I think we should all now express our thanks to Professor Moon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Katari.
So here is the
List of addresses?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No, you can, why don't you keep
Yes, we'll take it to our institute and...
It's my privilege to offer the vote of thanks at the conclusion of this enriching memorial lecture. First and foremost, I would extend my deepest gratitude to Professor Moon for delivering such a nuanced and intellectually stimulating lecture. His reflections on South Korea's diplomatic position amid US-China tensions have given us food for thought. We appreciate him for his depth, clarity, and the insight he brought to us through his lecture and the discussion. I would also like to express our appreciation to Professor 𝐂𝐴𝐶 for steering the session. We also thank our colleagues, staff members, and organizers who have worked behind the scenes and made this event possible. We also thank all of you in the audience for joining us this evening and contributing to the discussion through your presence and participation. With this, we come to the close of today's program. Before we disperse, I would request everyone to please come on this side of the stage behind the speaker and the chair for a group photo. Thank you once again and have a very good evening.